Or maybe just a little bit, maybe here and there. But I thought it would be certainly an important topic and an historic topic, because the word impeachment is out there, isn't it? You know, the word impeachment is there. It's in the, it's gone from lowercase to uppercase, and all I'll say about that is we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. What I'd like to spend some time on this morning is I'd like to go back to the Constitutional Convention, and don't leave home without it. I've got it here, and to talk about why the framers of the Constitution placed language for impeachment in the Constitution. And this was a hot debate. This was a divisive debate that swirled around this question. And the question is direct. Do we want to set up a procedure, where we can interrupt the sequence of elections? In other words, rather than waiting for an election to deal with the problem, to treat the problem, do we want language that might politicize the impeachment to the point that a Congress could step in and remove someone before the scheduled election? Let's say our next presidential election is 2020. We want to interrupt the election cycle. And that was a hot debate. And even Hamilton, in one of his essays, when we've talked about this before, his Federalist Papers, Federalist 65, that he sums up that debate a little bit. And the debate was, do we want to interrupt the election cycle? The four delegates from Massachusetts, there were four who attended the Constitutional Convention. They were split. Two of the delegates, two of them, Nathaniel Gorman and Rufus King, what they wanted to do was they said, let's interrupt the election cycle if we need to. If the problem is so grave, if it's such a high crime and misdemeanor, and I'll come back to those phrases in a little while, well, 10 or 15 minutes, that we ought to interrupt the election cycle. And Caleb Strong and Elbridge Gerry, I know most people pronounce it Jerry, but it's Gary, Elbridge Gerry, and they were of the opinion that, well, let's wait for an election to clean out, like a high tide coming through, and clean out the low tide. Let's not politicize this. It could spin out of control. In fact, the first draft of the impeachment language contained the phrase maladministration, like malpractice, and that was struck. It was seen as being too political. That could turn the president into a tool of Congress if the Congress simply disagreed with A or B. So that phrase maladministration was struck. So let's stay in Philadelphia here for a little bit. These men who gathered in Philadelphia, they were not dreamers. They were not ivory tower intellectuals. They were intellectual, but they weren't ivory tower professors. They knew human nature. These were men of business, men of trade, men of commerce, men of banking, slave owners. They knew human nature. They were more in the camp of Hobbes, that people need to be watched, than they were in the camp of Rousseau, that most people are pretty good most of the time. That human nature was easily corrupted, and they knew that. They knew that, and they feared power. They feared themselves. They knew how corrupting power could be. And that helped to animate the discussion about, begin to move it in the direction, if it's necessary, we do need to step in, and remove someone, and to exercise the principle of, and there were three governing principles at the Constitutional Convention. One was obviously federalism, sharing of power between the federal government and the state government, local government. And the other was separation of powers and checks and balances. The checking and balancing piece. You see, impeachment would be political. It would be conviction of and then removal from office. Any criminal indictments would come later in the federal courts. But impeachment was political, and we need this insurance policy. People are corrupt. I shouldn't say that baldly. People can be easily corrupted. Power is an aphrodisiac. Maybe they are corrupt, I don't know. Power is an aphrodisiac, and it can be abused, and it can be so enticing. And we need to be careful of that, and we need to be careful ourselves, because we know it is so. Benjamin Franklin, you know, who was the oldest fellow there, he was usually the oldest one at any affair. Those were the days. Remember when the cops were always older than we were?
And doctors.
That doesn't happen anymore, right? Benjamin Franklin, you know, made the observation, and it was quite correct, and they knew this. You know, that the first man we put at the helm, the ship of state, will be a good one. And this is Franklin. I was there. He said, after that, who knows? He didn't do that. But after that, who knows? And we need this insurance policy. We need language for impeachment. Which reminds me, well, I heard on the news yesterday that a lock of Washington's hair was found in an old textbook. I really enjoy it when those kind of stories surface, given to the son of Alexander Hamilton and then passed through the family. So in the interest of President's Day, you know, we got some Washington hair hanging around. And your homework, in the interest of Washington's birthday, your homework is to buy a car. I did mine. I have a brand new car, right? So I gave myself a self-assignment. So you have to do something for the economy as well. It's too bad that President's Day has become so generic, hasn't it? I mean, who remembers Millard T. Fillmore? Or Rutherford B. Hayes? Who remembers these guys? Or Martin Van Buren? Remember in the good old days, it was Washington and Lincoln in February. So your assignment, if you choose to take it, buy yourself a new vehicle. Treat yourself. Tell them I sent you. All right? I'm negotiating, we'll see where this goes, to maybe do a little commercial spot for Copeland Toyota. We'll see. We'll see. I bought about 4 or 5 Toyotas. They're great cars. Great cars. So, not to get sidetracked here, they fear power. And as they went through as they talked about the language, and let's go to the language here. Let's go to the language. It's a political process. The House of Representatives brings charges. The word is impeachment, and I'm going to underline that with you. Impeachment does not mean removal from office. We all think it means removal from office. It's being charged. It's as if you're going to court and you're charged with a felonious assault. Is that going to stick?
How did he know?
I'm Karnak. I see everything. It simply means to be charged. It does not mean to be convicted. So the House of Representatives brings charges, and any House member can introduce an article of impeachment as easily as one introduces a bill. And it's one way to grab a headline, isn't it? Grab a headline and get your 15 minutes of Andy Warhol time. It's easily done. The House brings charges. They impeach. Bill Clinton, for example.
Yeah.
Bill Clinton was impeached. He was impeached. But he was not found guilty. I'll come back to that in a little bit. So the House brings charges. The Senate acts as a jury. And that Senate acting as a jury, in order to convict, one needs 2/3 vote. All right, so here we have separation of powers, checks and balances. The House brings charges, they prosecute, and they have a prosecution team. The Senate acts as a jury, and the Supreme Court Chief Justice acts as the judge, and the rules of evidence apply. In other words, full disclosure, the reading statements, evidence, objection sustained, objection overruled. It's run as a courtroom procedure. Charged and then found guilty and removed from office. It hasn't happened yet. At the presidential level. 2 presidents have been impeached. Andrew Johnson, who followed Lincoln, and we'll do a little bit about how that came about. That was so political. And so was the Bill Clinton piece. I mean, Bill Clinton, it was bad judgment. It's not an impeachable offense. I mean, it's bad judgment. Bill Clinton was charged with 11 charges, Bill Clinton 2. I'm going to come back to all of that in a moment. So the House indicts, the Senate is a jury, Supreme Court Chief Justice is the presiding judicial officer. Now the language. You know, Gerald Ford caught it beautifully. You know, Gerald Ford one time was asked, you know, what's an impeachable offense? And Gerald Ford paused for a moment. He said, well, it's whatever the House says it is. Now that's pretty broad, huh? It depends on whatever the House says it is. Depends on the times. Depends on press coverage. Depends on the defendant. It depends. So much depends, doesn't it? It's a great word. That depends. We'll see. That's a great line. I always, we'll see. I like that line. We'll see. Or I'm uncomfortable with that question. That's one of my great lines. I'm uncomfortable with that question. Can we change the flow of the conversation? Not today. Impeachable. It's in Section 2. The Constitution has 7 articles, 7 sections. Section 2, Article 2, is the executive. And at the very end of Article 2, they drop in, and by the way, it bears repeating that, I mean, this Constitution is only about 8,000 words long, and they weren't looking to pad it. The reason impeachment language is there is because the majority of the delegates felt it was necessary. At the end of the day, at the end of the conversation, we need it. So let's tie it in to the very end of Article 2. How many times have you heard me say this? The oldest Constitution in the world, the shortest, and also it's only predated by the Massachusetts Constitution, which I cannot place in my pocket. This one, and the reason for that is that it was written primarily by John Adams, you know, who I think he had too much German blood in him. He did not know where to put a period. I mean, it just went on and on and on and on. So this fits very nicely here. It's brief. It's specific when the delegates felt it needed to be specific, and general language when we want to keep it general. You know, I'll get back to you on that. General language. The language for impeachment. The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of. Notice how they divided. Impeachment for and conviction of treason. They all knew what treason was. They committed it, hadn't they? When one signed the Declaration of Independence, that was, you were signing on as a traitor. They all knew what that was. Treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now let's look at that phrase. That phrase had a different context in the 18th century than it does for us today. When they used the phrase high crime, the word high did not mean, as they used the word high, it did not mean a particular nauseous crime, a toxic crime, a bad behavior. It simply meant a crime being committed by someone in a high office. A high crime, someone who was in a position to do harm, you know, to abuse the constitutional process, you know, to threaten democracy, to threaten election results. And by the way, one can only be impeached for behaviors as president. Anything you did, any behavior prior to the presidency is not impeachable. You're not president. It may be judicial in other respects, but it's behavior as president. A high crime, a misdemeanor. A misdemeanor had a different meaning as well. For you and for me, you're stealing hubcaps. All right, there's plenty of them out in that parking lot. It meant simply, it was a synonym for bad behavior, misdemeanor, a bad behavior, a behavior that, you know, that would abuse of power, you know, violation of public trust and so forth. And Gerald Ford's got it right. Depends on the defendant, depends on the time, depends on the mood of Congress, depends on press coverage. It depends. It always does. And they knew that this was a dangerous precedent. And we're not going to use it too often. 19 people have been impeached. Now, a Supreme Court justice, a federal justice, can be, and some, not a Supreme Court justice, but federal judges have been impeached. We usually think of it only in presidential or vice presidential terms. And that's why I thought it'd be of interest today to come by, this morning and to talk about it. Treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. When Andrew Johnson wound up on the ticket with Lincoln in 1860, Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. Lincoln was a Republican. So obviously you have to be thinking, what is Lincoln thinking of, putting a Democrat, on the ticket. And that Democrat is going to wind up as president in the aftermath of the Lincoln assassination. What Lincoln was thinking of, see, in November of 1864, the Civil War, the war between the states, I prefer that term, the war between the states. Now, it's okay in Norton, Massachusetts to use the term Civil War. That's okay. But you get into Virginia, you better use the phrase the war between the states. And if you go to Mississippi, it better be the war of northern aggression. And it better be the war of northern aggression. You damn Yankees. And that was one word, right? Damn Yankee. Johnson was placed on the ticket. Lincoln was politicizing the ticket. And by that I mean that I'm putting a Democrat on. And the South is Democratic. I mean, that was remember the phrase solid South? After the war between the states, it always voted Democrat because Republicans were these damn Yankees, these damn Republicans that started it all. Nixon broke that cycle in 68 and again in 72. Johnson's on the ticket, for 3 reasons. One, he's a Democrat. And I'm sending a signal to the Confederacy, which is on the ropes by November, December of 1864. The war is winding down, and it's not winding down to the benefit of the Confederacy. And I'm going to put a Democrat on the ticket, and I want these 11 Confederate states to know I'm listening to the point of view of Democrats. All of you Confederates are Democrats. You're the party of treason. He never said that. Yeah. He would never say that. But there were war Democrats. Andrew Johnson was a war Democrat. And the second reason, that Andrew Johnson, even though the state of Tennessee had seceded from the Union, and they left the Union, that Johnson, this is Lincoln's thinking, that Johnson had the good sense to remain in the Senate and to represent the interests of Tennessee, even though they've left the Union. Good judgment, good sense. That secession was unconstitutional. The framers never set up a republic to divide and then redivide. Good judgment. He's a man of good judgment. And even though he's not getting paid, he's still representing the interests of Tennessee in the Senate. There were 22 senators, representing the 11 states of the Confederacy. 21 resigned. Johnson stayed. Good judgment. Good man. Good judgment. I'm going to hear the point of view of Democrats here as well, through the mind, through the lips of Johnson. And thirdly, Andrew Johnson's a self-made man, like myself. Remember Lincoln? I don't mean myself, but Lincoln. Lincoln had no more than a 3rd grade education, and so much flowed from that excellent mind. Lincoln had a way of ducking a hostile conversation. And it really annoyed people. He would say, "That reminds me of a story." Remember that? That reminds me of a story. And that's how he would slide around a difficult conversation. And people knew he would do it, which meant I don't want to talk about it. That is a code. That was the code language he used. I don't want to talk about this now. I'm sure he used that with Mary a lot of times. We're not here to chat about that. A Democrat, a self-made man, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson bootstrapped himself up. He was a tailor and became a mayor and became a represented Tennessee in the House of Representatives, and then moved on to the Senate. A self-made man, a man whose wife polished up his reading and writing abilities. I mean, he almost came on the scene illiterate, but he was a self-made man. He's a Democrat, and he shows good judgment. I'm on the ticket. Only Lincoln could have pulled that off. Only Lincoln had the cachet to be able to pull that off. He'd won his war. It was almost won. And this is where Johnson's going to get in trouble. Johnson brings all of this on himself. It is political. It is a catfight between Johnson and a Republican Congress, Democrat Republican Congress, with the death of Lincoln. Johnson assumed that he had all the authority of Lincoln, all the moral authority and all the, political clout of Lincoln, that he stepped right in. He's a step president, is what he is, an accidental president. And he stepped into Lincoln's 14-size shoes, and I didn't make that up, it was a 14. He's had big feet. And that Johnson, I am the president, and I have full powers over Reconstruction. What will be the terms that the defeated Confederacy must accept to rejoin the Union? I will call the shots. I am the president. Lincoln had been thinking about that as well. And Lincoln's concepts, plural, on Reconstruction, is that, and that's the term to bring them back in, that'll be rapid, it will be compassionate, and non-retributive. You know, we're going to put this war behind us and become a union again. In fact, when Lincoln ran in '64, and you can check me on this. Go to the computer. If you look at the election posters for 1864, it does not say Republican. Lincoln ran. He renamed the party for that election, the National Union Party, a nation and a union. This isn't a Republican issue. This is the national issue to restore the Union, to restore the nation. And in that second inaugural, he uses language that gives voice to the concept of a rapid, non-retributive, compassionate Reconstruction. And we all know the words, don't we? We all know the phrases. We've grown up with them. With malice toward none. Remember that? With malice toward none, with charity for all. To bind up the nation's wounds. These are to care for him who was borne the burden of battle. That's Lincoln. And then he's gone. I mean, John Wilkes Booth in April 1865, and suddenly Andrew Johnson is President of the United States. He's sworn in at 10 o'clock that morning by Salmon Chase, Supreme Court Chief Justice. And in the few remarks that Johnson made after the swearing in, and a few people caught this and wondered, are we going to have a problem with this guy? He did not mention Lincoln's name once. He mentioned himself 15 times. Johnson was an argumentative man. He had a chip on his shoulder. He had a 2x4 on his shoulder. He just let things roll out of his mouth. He needed a filter. And I'll come back to that later. He would just say whatever popped into his head. Now that sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's called tweeting. It's not the bully pulpit any longer. It's whatever tweeting pulpit. And he was argumentative. He was arrogant. I am the president, and I am going to handle Reconstruction. I will provide the ground rules for those 11 states to get in. The war between the states was 4 years, wasn't it? Reconstruction took 12 years to finally get that all wrapped up. And that wasn't wrapped up until 1876, and maybe we'll have some time to talk about how that got wrapped up. So here is Johnson. I am the president, and I don't need to consult with Congress. Lincoln would never, and we've talked about this, Lincoln, I can have conversations with people long dead. It's very easy. It's very simple. You just talk in the car and nobody hears you. Lincoln would never have allowed the process to become so difficult. Never. He was too shrewd, too political, too smart, too cautious, that this is a national issue and I need to involve my party, my Congress. Never would have gotten as bad as it did under Johnson. So what does Johnson do? Well, he grants all these pardons. You see, Lincoln had talked about pardoning people. And Johnson granted pardons to anyone who asked for a pardon. And Johnson, see, Johnson, the chip on his shoulder, Johnson despised, he called them a purse-proud set. Johnson despised these elegant, wealthy Southern planters, men with a pedigree, with a name, with money, that they had looked down on men like me, down their long, bony noses at men like me, self-made men. And now, some of them, in order to join the political process, they need to come to me, and I will pardon them. And he enjoyed every moment of it. And can't you hear it? Can't you hear it, Johnson? Let's say something from Alabama or Mississippi, Virginia. Mr. President, sir, I humbly, sir, implore you for a pardon, so that I can help the people of Alabama, sir, adjust to this loss, the lost cause, that I can bring them into the Union. And sir, I can only do that with your permission, sir. And it's regrettable, Mr. President, it's regrettable, sir, that the great Abraham Lincoln has been taken away. But sir, the Lord has provided. You, sir, one of us, a Democrat. You, sir, the good judgment of staying in your seat, to represent the farm people of Tennessee. You, sir, I humbly ask for your pardon, sir. Johnson, would you say it just like that again? Yes.
What do they have to be pardoned for? I'm sorry.
For treason.
But they were, I thought.
Lincoln had talked about, and again, Lincoln had talked, and Lincoln was always, everything was in a state of flux, everything was maybe, and Lincoln was talking about perhaps high officers of the Confederacy, political and military, in order to rejoin the political process, must seek a pardon from me, or maybe Congress as well. And Johnson simply took it upon himself that I am pardoning you, following Lincoln's lead on that. And he gave them, he had bushel baskets full of pardons. And I can see one guy walking out, can't you, and saying, I got my pardon. What'd y'all say? Say it just like this, right? And you'll have him like putty, right? And drop your eyes and make sure you humbly, sir, I ask you for pardon, sir. Say it just like that, so I can help the good people of Mississippi rejoin the Union. And he gave them away. He just gave them away. So in December of 1865, and I'll be brief here, we want to get the impeachable part going. So Lincoln, in March, Lincoln is sworn in. The election's November, and back then the inaugurals were in March, not January. So he's sworn in March of 1865, and everybody's there. The war's almost over. What's Lincoln going to say? He's going to be vindictive. What will be the tone, the spirit of the inaugural? And then they all go home. Because back then, being a member of Congress was really a part-time job. They were not scheduled to reconvene until December of 1865. So everybody's there in March to witness the inaugural and to hear what Lincoln is going to say. Then everybody goes home. And Johnson pardons everybody. And it brings all the states back in. So when Congress convenes in December of 1865, they're all on the steps of the Capitol. How y'all doing? How's the family? How y'all doing? Hey, you think I could get my office back? The one that had the wonderful view of the rolling Potomac. It's a great office. Y'all think I could get that back? You still have grits on the menu? Who are you guys? Some of these people showed up in their Confederate uniforms. That's not smart. They showed up in their Confederate uniforms. The vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, was voted in to represent Georgia in the Senate. Who let you all in? What are you all doing? Andrew Johnson? President Andrew Johnson said, we're pardoned. You absolve. You're pardoned. You're not pardoned. He didn't ask us. He needs to consult us. No, he said he did not have to consult you. So I'm the president. Y'all in? Oh, no. Oh, no, no. And you know in the Constitution it's quite clear, that the leadership of the House and the Senate have to certify elections, don't they? Are we going to seat this person? Remember the Moore guy in Alabama? And Mitch Malone? Are we going to seat this guy? If he gets elected, we never had to deal with that. Well, they never had to, Mitch McConnell. So, no, Johnson has to consult with us. The Republican Party, and sometimes they're referred to as radical Republicans, and that's an unfortunate term. It makes them sound like Bolsheviks. The term radical Republican was the term that was used, and the reason it was they were called radical Republicans is that they had, at least initially, they were willing to work with Johnson. They had two issues. One, what will be the terms for getting back in? And will we require that you give black men, the right to vote? Will we require that? Will we require you well, I'll tell you what everybody said. As a precondition, you have to accept the 13th Amendment. Even when Johnson brought them in, he said, slavery's over, guys. 13th Amendment, it's done. Now, whether or not you're going to give folks the right to vote, that's another issue. What will be the terms? How extensive? How punitive will they be? And secondly, and this is, we need to take care of the freedmen. That was the name used to describe former slaves. The freedmen. We need to take care of them. Most of them, all of them, are penniless. They cannot read or write. And we need a bridge so they can move from slavery to be participating citizens. We simply can't turn them loose. I don't mean it that way. They need to be prepared for freedom. It might take generations for that. And what Congress did is they passed a measure and they asked Johnson to sign it. He'll veto it. It was called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau simply was, and this was available to whites as well, a food pantry, if you will, medical care, supervision of work contracts to make certain that black men and women didn't sign contracts they couldn't read, they couldn't spell, they couldn't cipher, that slavery by another name. And we need military courts there, Johnson. We don't need military courts, there are state courts. I let these states back in. Presidential reconstruction. You haven't provided anything, for the freedmen. I don't have to. The states will take care of it. The state of Mississippi will take care of it. And so this Freedmen's Bureau, along with schooling and along with protection for whites and blacks, and along with food pantries, if you will, schools. So many women, they were called carpetbaggers, weren't they? We know that term. Coming from the north, coming from Boston, coming from New York, coming from Ohio. And these young women, Freedmen's Bureau schools, wonderful photographs, beautiful, beautiful photographs. These old men and women, long in the tooth, sitting on a narrow bench, with a tablet and a piece of chalk, and sitting next to them, their grandchildren. And I want to learn to read, I want to learn to write, and I want to learn to cipher. I want to make a point of this, because emotionally it's important. I want to be able to write my name. If I can write my name, that gives me identity, doesn't it? I know how to make my name. That makes me a man, a woman, a child. It gives me identity. I want to know how to make my name. And when I learn how to make my name, then I need a last name. And many of the last names were Washington, Jefferson, or Jackson, weren't they? But to be able to write your name, isn't that wonderful when you can write your, is that too much to ask? I want to be able to write my name. I was property. I didn't even have a last name. I didn't need a last name. I was property, like a horse or a cow. You don't give a horse or a cow a last name unless you got problems. All right? I want to be able to give myself a last name and to write it. Is that too much to ask? You know, and then I want to be able to read. I want to read the Bible. I want to read the words. I don't want the words told to me by a white planter. I want to read the words. And if I can read and I can write, thirdly, I want to be able to marry properly and not be married by the planter. I want to be married in the church. I want to be able to read the wedding certificate, and I want to be able to sign it, and it gives me identity. Is that too much to ask? And that's what these radical Republicans, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, Sumner Tunnel, he was one of the leaders of that group. We need a bridge. It'll take generations for this. So it winds up hanging on Johnson's desk, and he vetoes it. Absolutely not. They're back in the Union, and the state of Mississippi can take care of the interests of the people of Mississippi. I'm not picking on Mississippi. We can say North Carolina or Arkansas, if you like. Johnson vetoed it, and Congress promptly overrode the veto. This is going to win you money on a quiz show. The first time ever that a presidential veto was overridden is when this Congress overrode Johnson's veto of the Freedmen's Bill. We need this. This is a piece of adjustment. It's like the GI Bill. The GI Bill was called the Readjustment Act or something, to adjust from slavery to freedom, and Johnson vetoed it. And there were all kinds of skirmishing with Congress over this and other issues as well. I don't want to belabor the point here. The point is his personality, his temper, his inability, unwillingness to cooperate, to compromise, to work with you. Where can we find common ground here? And in 1866, here comes the impeachment. Here it comes right here. In 1866, the off-year election, 64, 68, 2016, 2020, 2018, off-year election, 1866. Andrew Johnson campaigned against Republicans. He went out there and he campaigned against Republicans. Give me a Democratic Congress, so that I can handle Reconstruction and end it. And when he went out and campaigned, that's when he lost his temper, he lost his judgment, and he made the charge that Abraham Lincoln, that there were members of his party, the Republican Party, who conspired to assassinate Lincoln. And they conspired to assassinate me. And I know who you are. Now, just to refresh your memory, it's always good to get your memory stirred up again. Absolutely. Just to refresh your memory, that the night that John Wilkes Booth, he and his cohorts, is that Lincoln on the phone? I'll take the call. I'll take the call. I must have missed something. When that assassination squad moved out across Washington, they fanned out across Washington. Their targets included, didn't it? Lincoln, Johnson, Secretary of State Seward, Secretary of War Stanton. If they could catch him, if they could get him, Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of Appomattox. So Johnson, not only are you responsible, did you conspire in Lincoln's death, you came after me as well. You tried to remove me as well, so you could get one of your guys in there. Because the road to presidential succession back there was the next guy up with the Speaker Pro Tem, and that was Ben Wade of Ohio, Republican, one of them, Ben Wade, and Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens and George Julian talked about, this never happened. Remember the phrase 40 acres and a mule? Mm-hmm. To take the land of planters and parcel it out to to former slaves. 40 acres and a mule. The only talents they have are farming. And I need to, and that's why I need to be able to cipher. When I bring my crops to market, I want to get cheated. But that never happened, 40 acres and a mule. That was too much. But Johnson, you conspired against Lincoln, you conspired against me. And from the crowd came the shouts, And Johnson could be easily heckled. Name names, Mr. President. Name names. I'll give you names. Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, Ben Wade. I'll give you names. And the Republican Party are aghast. He's naming names that we conspired against Lincoln. Who is this nutcase? Who is this guy? We got to get him out. Is there language here? Yeah, let me look for it. I think it's Article 2, Section 4. We'll find it quickly, dust it off, polish it up. We've got to get this guy for high crimes and misdemeanors. And how are we going to get him? We're going to set a trap for him. And he's so impulsive. He's so impulsive, he'll see it and he'll step right into it. And we've got him. It's a political thing, and we got him. And here's the trap. It's a beauty. Congress passed, Johnson vetoed it, and rightly so, by the way, and you'll understand why I said this in a minute. Congress passed a measure. It has a very bland name. It was called the Tenure, T-E-N-U-R-E, the Tenure of Office Act. And it simply said that any person in a federal position that had any federal position that required confirmation by the Senate, that only the Senate can remove that person. That the president cannot fire anybody who has been confirmed by the Senate, approved by the Senate. Now, and to do so, to violate the Tenure of Office Act, to do so, and this is right in the measure, was a high crime and misdemeanor. Right? To fire anybody that required Senate confirmation, and without our permission, is a high crime and misdemeanor. That's how they defined it. Now, we all know that the cabinet serves at the pleasure of the president, hire and fire, and for the most part, with the exception of the president incumbent, but for the most part, the Senate, gives the president the team he wants. It's like a new manager, like it's Cora. He's going to get a batting coach, his pitching coach, he's going to bullpen coach, he's going to get his bench coach. This is my team. Now, who are they? Lincoln's cabinet came to Johnson. He inherited Lincoln's cabinet. And Johnson, who is the Judas here? Who is the Judas in this cabinet? Every time I make a decision, every time I indicate a line of attack, something I'm going to do to counter Congress, they know about it immediately. Who is the Judas in here? Somebody is betraying me, personal. And there was a somebody. It was Secretary of War Edward Stanton, who was a mole. And as soon as, and even before it hit the newspapers, even before Johnson figured out what he's going to do, bang, the Congress knows what I'm going to do. Stanton, I know it is. I know it's Stanton. It's Stanton. You're fired. The apprentice, right? You're fired. Clear out your desk. Clear out your filing cabinet. You are fired, Mr. Stanton. You can't fire me, Mr. President. Congress, the Senate is protecting me. You can't fire me. You're fired. I'm not fired. This is great. This would be great television today. He locked himself in his office, Stanton did, for 4 or 5 days. You can't fire me. You have no authority to. And so for 4 or 5 days, he's holed up in his office. Now, I can't make this up. It's too sweet. Lift open the window. Fellas, I'm hungry. And he had a basket, and he tied the basket to one end of the rope. And Big Mac, Coke, fries, and I need toothpaste and a toothbrush, and send up some fresh underwear. Okay. So there he is. Boom, boom, boom. Thanks, guys. I'll see you in the morning. So he's lowering a basket to get stuff. Great. Can you imagine today? It'd be one. I could play that. I could do that. Yelling from the 3rd-story window. Guys, come on, come on. Huh? Colgate, not Crest. Eventually, he'll leave the office. Now he has violated the Tenure of Office Act, and it's right there. It's right there. We said to do so is a high crime and misdemeanor. So the Senate, rather the House, votes 11 articles of impeachment, 11. And they all pretty much say the same thing. A, he violated the Tenure of Office Act. B, he accused us of being assassins. C, he's absolutely bananas. You know, I mean, his behavior is very unpolitical. And 11 charges of impeachment goes to and this is the hottest ticket in town. This is in March of 1868. This is a hot ticket. And the House is going to prosecute. Andrew Johnson does not show up. He doesn't have to. Money is raised to provide him with a crackerjack legal team. That the Tenure of Office Act is unconstitutional. It violates checks and balances, separation of powers. The president is exercising his right to hire and fire a cabinet. And that's his constitutional right. It's precedent. Washington started that. The Senate has no position here, except to, in a very rudimentary way, approve. And it violates separation of powers, checks and balances. The president is acting within the context of the law, within the context of past practice. A lot of money changed hands. A lot of, what's new, right? Yeah. A lot of money changed hands. We want this guy out, so we can put our guy in, Ben Wade, who's one of us, a radical Republican. And then we're really going to turn the clock back after Appomattox, and they will. I'll get to that shortly. Everyone knew the vote would be close. You needed 2/3. That's a supermajority. Everyone knew the vote would be close. And as the roll is called, you know, and you get to, you know, aye, nay, nay, aye, nay, nay, and the leaderboard, there it is. It's going to be real close. And for the senator, a young man, newly elected from the state of Kansas, his name was Ross. He's sitting there. Can you imagine what he's thinking? It's coming to me. It'll be my vote. You know, sometimes, it's coming to me. I can't hide. It's going to be my vote. And it came to him. And he was getting telegrams from Kansas. We want him out. Vote to convict, convict, convict. If you do not vote to convict, you better not cast your shadow in Kansas again. A rope won't be good enough for you, you Judas. A rope won't be good enough. We need to get rid of Andrew Johnson. It's coming to me. And then the Senate chambers went very, very quiet. And as he said, I'm looking at the floor, and I'm thinking, as he said later on, I looked into my open grave. And it's just quiet. And finally, Chief Justice, Senator, yeah, your vote, sir. Please, your vote. Nay, the place exploded. Johnson was saved by one vote. Not Johnson, the presidency. So it would not be treated so politically. Obviously, he lost his job. And he was followed for days before the vote, He would go into a hotel dining room, and people would take tables around him and just stare at him. Oh, God. You better vote right. That's pressure, isn't it? Yes. People just staring at you, being trailed. How much money, sir? This isn't about money. This is about a constitutional principle. So he is spared. And Ulysses S. Grant is nominated by the Republican Party. Grant wins in '68. Johnson goes back to Tennessee, and guess what? He's elected back to the Senate from the state of Tennessee. So talk about coming full circle, right? Wow. Now, Bill Clinton, Slick Willie. Bill Clinton, 2 charges of impeachment: perjury and obstruction of justice. And obviously, classic bad judgment, not an impeachable offense. Impeachment is political, but he's impeached for it. Ken Starr wasted millions of your dollars, my dollars, getting after Clinton. He loathed Clinton. Clinton loathed him. It was personal. I think Hillary contributed to Ken Starr's payroll too. Wherever all of that finally winds up. The perjury. And remember Clinton gave the interview and what is.
Yeah, what is it?
Talk about twisting words around, huh? The meaning of is. What does is mean? I'm not quite sure. I'm uncomfortable with that question. Ask me what was means. And so when the verdict came in, when the Senate was polled for perjury, it was 50 ayes and it was 50 nays. You needed 2/3. All right. When the second charge of impeachment was brought up for a vote, obstruction of justice. Listen, perjury leads to obstruction of justice. Obstruction of justice, that is a broad term, isn't it? That can really be expanded, or it's like a strike zone. You know, you either get a big strike zone or you get a small strike zone. And it was 55 nay and 45 aye, so it's not a 2/3 either way. So Bill Clinton survives the presidency, and I'm convinced if he could have run for a third term, he would have, and he would have been elected. I know he would have been elected. And so two impeachment proceedings. Both the impeachments are successful, the convictions are not successful. And Nixon, if I can drop him here in just for a moment, he would have been impeached, he would have been convicted, and then he would have been subject to criminal investigation afterwards. But he resigned, didn't he? I mean, he resigned because the leaders of the House and the leaders of the Senate went to him, and they gave him the numbers, and they were cold. And numbers don't lie. They gave it to him with the bark off, as Barry Goldwater said. We're not going to sweet talk you here, Mr. President. You don't have the numbers. You've got maybe 15 or a dozen in the Senate that'll vote to acquit. The numbers aren't there. You're going to be convicted. You might face criminal proceedings in civilian court. You're going to lose your pension. You're going to lose your franking privilege. Probably your Secret Service protection, unless the Congress votes otherwise. So Nixon chose to resign, didn't he? And that's when the 25th Amendment, the 25th Amendment kicked in, where there's a vacancy in the presidency, the vice president moves up, and then he nominates a vice president subject to the approval of Congress. The 25th Amendment, and I've mentioned this to you in other contexts, it's a very, I'll even get to it. Part 1 and Part 2 we've used. That the president nominates a new vice president, and we know that that's happened twice. Agnew, Ford to Rockefeller. The third part of the 25th Amendment is lightning in a bottle. Read it. That's your homework. You don't have to buy a car. So you have an alternative. You can either read the 25th Amendment, or you can go out and buy yourself a new Toyota. All right? Read the 25th Amendment, and then tell me what it means. It is so convoluted. It is a model of separation of powers and checks and balances. And it's one way to remove a president. But it would take the collaboration of the vice president and the cabinet and the Congress. Read it over. It is a minefield. And Michael Pence is not going to call a cabinet meeting and say, boys and girls, we need to take a vote here and begin to get the ball rolling to remove the president. That's one way. Impeachment, 25th Amendment, resignation, those are all legitimate. Read the 25th Amendment and then tell me what it means. And the best way to figure it out is to get a piece of paper and a pen and diagram it, trace it. If A happens, B happens. When B happens, C and D. And then we go back to A. And then we go over to C and D again. Read it. It's so convoluted. And the best way to keep track of it is to diagram it. When's the last time you diagrammed a sentence? You all remember, don't you? Kids don't diagram sentences anymore. Diagram the 25th Amendment. It is a difficult amendment to sort out. You can sort it out if you do it gradually. And you have to pay attention, though. Whenever you try to do it on the blackboard, I get it so confused. I've got all these arrows going everywhere, and eventually I'll say, screw it, read it on your own. And you tell me what it means. So let me stop here for a moment. Impeachment, again, it's political. It's a political. Nothing one does prior to the presidency counts. It's in office. Are you violating a more perfect union, a public trust, if you will? You know, and a high crime, it depends. It depends. And a misdemeanor, it depends. And the word crime, it's not a crime. It's political, but they use the word high crime. That's the beauty of the Constitution, isn't it? It's a great piece to read, isn't it? And you've heard me say this before, and I'll say it again. I always tell the guys, if you're out on a date, and it isn't working with Jennifer, all you need to do is say, Jennifer, I'm going to show you something. Pay attention. And all you need to do is withdraw the Constitution, and I tell them you will have her for that day and all days. It's catnip. You'll have her for all days. And just do it very carefully so she's paying attention. Jennifer, your attention please, dear. Jennifer. Watch what I'm going to show you. And they all think, man, you didn't take your medicine today. And I said, yeah, I took 2. I took it twice. Or if, you know, if you're at a wedding and it's pretty boring and you want to be at the hot table, all you need to do is bring the Constitution out. And people tip over tables and chairs and leave their meals unfinished to get to your table because it's the hot table. You know, you're talking about the Constitution. It's magic. Absolute magic. So I interrupted myself. Question, observation? Something I can help you with? Help you out of the room? I don't know. 1, 2. Yes, sir.
You know, we talk about divided government today.
Sure.
Yet it seems to me that this post-time, where Sumner and the boys from the north were telling, you know, this is going to happen, and, you know, you're dealing with the South coming out of the Civil War. I mean,
They still are.
do we pat ourselves on the back? Northerners do, that somehow we got it right and they got it wrong, and
Who,
you
the
know,
North and the South?
Yeah.
Boy, you can say that in Norton, Massachusetts.
I know.
But you cannot say that in Biloxi, Mississippi. You can't say that. You're a damn Yankee.
Well, I spent some time in the South, and I had never been there before, and I don't find some people necessarily, you know, hard to deal. Nice folks.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. It was 100 years ago for some people.
Yeah.
And it was last month for some people.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to get too caught up here, but in the Constitution and Lincoln, what else is in here? Oh, that's where that rabbit went. I do have that trick too, you know. Sometimes the rabbit pops out of my pocket. And that's another story. But what's the punchline to a joke? What is it? Resuscitate the rabbit? About if you're pregnant or something or whatever. I can't remember the lead up to the joke. Lincoln, there is no language in here. There is no language in here that prohibits secession. None at all. None at all. And Lincoln said, you're right. You're right. There's no language here that prevents secession, leaving the Union. So, but I'll tell you, there's another piece here. And the reason there's no language, this is Lincoln, is that those who framed the Constitution, 77, those who framed the Constitution never thought anyone would want to leave. And they place in language to admit states, but not to allow states to leave. Because who would want to leave? This is the best deal going. Who would want to leave me? You got the best deal ever. You think you're going to find another me? You think you've got the best deal going. And there's no language here to leave because who would ever want to leave? There's language to admit states, not to allow states to slip away from the gravity of we the people and a more perfect union. That's how Lincoln saw it. And Southerners made the case, and it's a legitimate case. There's nothing here that says we have to stay. We joined voluntarily. Our grandfathers joined voluntarily, and now we're leaving. We're not safe here anymore. We don't trust Lincoln. You know, we think he's Abraham Africanus, you know, that he's an abolitionist. You know, in the 3 a.m. of his soul, if he gets to be elected president, he's going to recommend that slavery be abolished. And we're going to beat him to the punch. Before he's even sworn in, we're pulling out. 7. And then when he fired on when he fired on Fort Sumter, depending how you phrase it, 4 more states left the Union. And whenever you put Lincoln in the title of something, I mean, it draws people.
Yeah.
I always like to, when I talk about Sumter, I always like to refer to it, I advertise it, Lincoln starts a war. And that Lincoln starts a war. What's this fellow talking about? And I'm talking about the setup at Fort Sumter. And he very cleverly laid a trap for Governor Pickens of South Carolina and Jeff Davis of President of the Confederacy. Yes, sir. I hadn't forgotten about you.
When the vote to
Excuse me.
impeach Bill Clinton went to
When the vote, what?
To impeach Clinton, you said it was 55 to 45?
Correct.
Not to impeach?
Right, not guilty on the charge of obstruction of justice.
Did any Democrats vote to
I'd have to
impeach?
look at, I'd have to check my notes on that,
That's
okay?
fine.
I'm sure they did, at their peril.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Look, if you take a shot at the king, you better kill him, right?
Yeah.
If you take a run at the king, you better get rid of him, because he's coming back at you, wouldn't you? You take a shot, you take a run at me, there's gonna be consequences here, big consequences. I got you.
Hi. Election in November.
This November.
Okay, so let's talk about presidential elections. So in November, you're elected. It's not till January you're sworn in. Anything that occurs between that time is not impeachable.
You're not
because
president.
You're not president.
You're not
So
president.
January.
Yeah.
So any action that took place
From November to January,
is not impeachable.
technically not impeachable. It depends.
Depends.
It depends. But it's as president. It depends, doesn't it? And we know that the law is, well, I mean, the law can be twisted and like a piece of taffy, can it? It depends. It depends on who, why. It depends on who your enemies are. Who have you offended lately? Who have you offended lately? Oh, you still have your Valentine's. What time is it? Is it a watch? No. All right, okay. It's a pen. Please.
Gerald Ford, who you mentioned, I will always remember what he said when he pardoned, after he pardoned Nixon, that our long national nightmare is over.
Absolutely.
And I pray every night that we'll be hearing that phrase again much sooner.
That our long national nightmare is over. And you pray every night that phrase will be repeated. Yeah. That pardon cost Ford election in his own right. And without that, he gets elected in his own right, in my view. And Jimmy Carter played that perfectly, the way he nuanced it. And the Republican Party, read Republican Party here in the words that I'm about to use, that this is Carter, that the American people deserve a government as good as they are. And you're reading Republican, and you're reading Nixon, and you're reading Ford, that you deserve a government as good as you are. As good as you are. I'm the guy. That's Carter, without referring to it specifically, you see. You deserve a government as good as you are. Vote for me. I will never lie to you. You can't say that. Everybody lies. I mean, you can't say as a president, I will never lie to you. It depends. You need a little wiggle room, right? You need to dance around a little bit. Something else? When will I see you again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain? I think that's the opening line from Macbeth, isn't it? I think it is. I know I'm going to see you in March. I'm not quite sure when. Wait a minute. That's next month. All right, maybe I will see you as early as March. I'm not sure. But be well, be good, and vote early. Vote often. All right? Take care. Thank you. Read the 25th Amendment. Thank you. Figure out the 25th Amendment. For me.
Wasn't it worth coming alive?